They trusted him. He was the last friendly face they ever saw. A warm smile in the rearview mirror. A polite nod. A smooth voice asking, "Where to?" Everything about him seemed normal. Safe. But the moment that door locked, the moment the route changed, the moment they realized something wasn't right, it was already too late. His hands were strong. Strong enough to hold the wheel for 12-hour shifts. Strong enough to carry luggage, groceries, a lifeless body. And when his grip tightened around their throats, the struggle never lasted long. There was no escape, no mercy, no second chances. Florida's streets were never safe at night. Because when the sun went down, cab driver Paul Parker was hunting. If you love true crime and want to uncover more disturbing stories, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification button. Trust me, this one will stay with you long after the video ends. To his passengers, Paul Parker was just another cab driver, a familiar face in the late-night streets of Florida. He knew every shortcut, every back road, and every quiet stretch where traffic was scarce. He was polite, patient, even charming at times. To some, he was a lifesaver, picking up those stranded at bus stops, those too tired or tipsy to drive, those who just needed to get home. He made conversation when prompted, stayed silent when needed, and never seemed to be in a rush. He wasn't just a driver. He was someone you could trust to get you where you needed to go safely. And they did trust him. Why wouldn't they? He looked ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of man you'd barely notice in a crowd. He had a kind smile, a soft voice, and a calm, steady presence. He wore a neatly pressed shirt, his cab was clean, and his driving was smooth and careful. He never overcharged. He never acted aggressively. He was, by all appearances, one of the good ones. For many he was nothing more than a ride home. Just another cab driver. Someone you'd forget the moment you stepped out of the car. But some of his passengers never made it home. They never even got close. Paul Parker had a preference. A pattern. His targets were always the same. Women traveling alone, often late at night, often unaware that their decision to step into his cab would be the last choice they ever made. Some had been out drinking, their guard down, their reflexes slow. Others were distracted, scrolling through their phones, lost in their own world, oblivious to the fact that the route was changing. A turn down a street they didn't recognize. A detour that wasn't necessary. A sudden stop in a place that didn't look right. And then the slow realization. Something wasn't right. Can you imagine that feeling? That sudden shift in your stomach when you realize the car is heading in the wrong direction? That moment when you glance at the driver and see something in his eyes that wasn't there before? Panic sets in. Your heart races. You think about opening the door, jumping out, screaming for help, but it's too late. The doors are locked. You're moving faster now, down a road with no streetlights, no houses, no signs of life. And the man behind the wheel isn't the same man who smiled at you when you got in. Paul Parker didn't need a weapon. He didn't carry a gun, a knife, or even a rope. He didn't leave a mess. He didn't leave traces of struggle in his cab. His hands were all he needed. Large, strong, deliberate hands that tightened around the throats of his victims with practiced ease. He knew exactly how long it took. He knew how their bodies would react, the way their fingers would claw at his arms, the way their feet would kick against the seat. He knew when to squeeze harder. He knew when they were about to lose consciousness. And he knew exactly when to let go. No scream. No fight. Just silence. Have you ever been in a cab alone at night? Have you ever wondered, just for a moment, if the driver was taking you exactly where you needed to go? Have you ever felt your stomach drop when the car made an unexpected turn? If you have, you know the fear. The helplessness. The way your mind starts racing through every worst-case scenario. But unlike Parker's victims, you made it home. They didn't. For 5 years, bodies were discovered in places people barely noticed. Abandoned lots where weeds grew taller than the street signs, dumpsters behind gas stations that no one thought to check until the smell became unbearable, swampy canals where the water washed away evidence but never erased the crime. Each victim was found in a different place, but the pattern remained the same. They had all taken a ride. They had all trusted the wrong man. And they had all died the same way. Despite the growing number of cases, no one suspected Paul Parker. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't sloppy. He was careful, methodical, and, most importantly, invisible. A cab driver blending into the background of a busy city, just another face in the crowd. He didn't fit the profile of a serial killer. He wasn't the loner lurking in the shadows. He wasn't the outcast, the drifter, the one people whispered about. He was just Paul, the friendly guy behind the wheel. The man who drove people home. So how many women stepped into that cab without realizing the danger they were in? How many more had a close call and didn't even know it? How many times did someone sit in his back seat, unaware that just hours before, someone else had died right where they were sitting? His victims had no idea what kind of man was sitting behind the wheel. And by the time they realized, it was already too late. Paul Parker had a routine. He worked the late shift from midnight to dawn, the hours when the city was at its quietest, when the streets were nearly empty, and when the most vulnerable people were left wandering, desperate for a way home. He knew these streets better than anyone, knew which roads were lined with cameras and which alleys stayed hidden in the dark. He knew where to drive if he didn't want to be seen, and more importantly, he knew where to leave a body so it wouldn't be found for days, sometimes weeks. He had perfected his method, honed it with every passing year, and by the time police realized what they were dealing with, it was already too late for at least 6 women. Victim number 1. Jessica Monroe, April 5, 1997. Jessica Monroe was 23 years old, a waitress working long hours at a small diner just outside downtown Miami. That night, she had just finished a grueling shift, her feet aching, the scent of coffee and grease still clinging to her uniform as she stepped out into the cool night air. The surveillance cameras outside the diner captured her standing there at 2:17 a.m., leaning against the wall, scrolling through her phone, exhausted. A few minutes later, a yellow cab pulled up to the curb. She looked relieved, tucked her phone into her bag and climbed into the back seat. The door shut. The cab rolled away. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. 3 days later, her body was discovered in an empty lot near the edge of the city, partially concealed beneath a pile of discarded debris. There were no signs of sexual assault. No defensive wounds. No blood. Just dark, bruised imprints around her throat, the unmistakable mark of strangulation. Police had no suspects, no witnesses, no evidence that pointed to anything more than a random act of violence. Without leads, the case faded from the headlines, her name becoming just another unsolved tragedy. And Paul Parker kept driving. Victim number 2. Maria Sanchez, July 29, 1998. Maria Sanchez was 21 years old, a psychology student at the University of Florida with her entire future ahead of her. That night, she had been out celebrating a friend's birthday at a crowded bar, surrounded by laughter, music, and the haze of too many drinks. The night slipped away faster than she realized, and by the time she stepped outside, it was nearly 3 a.m. Her phone was dead. She was alone. She needed a ride. Witnesses remember her standing at the curb, flagging down a cab, a yellow one. She got in without hesitation, giving the driver her address. The cab pulled away, vanishing into the night. When Maria didn't show up for class the next morning, her friends weren't immediately concerned. Maybe she had slept in, maybe she was recovering from the night before. But when their calls went straight to voicemail and messages went unanswered, concern turned into dread. By that evening, a missing persons report had been filed. Her body was found 6 days later, floating in a canal nearly 30 miles from where she was last seen. She had been strangled. No signs of a struggle. No evidence of robbery or assault. Just a life stolen in a matter of moments, erased as if she had never existed. Victim number 3. Lauren Davis, February 15, 1999. Lauren Davis wasn't out partying. She wasn't walking alone late at night. She was a mother, just trying to get home to her 4-year-old son after picking up an extra shift at the hospital. At 1:45 a.m. she called for a cab. A coworker saw her step into the back seat of a yellow taxi. They even waved goodbye. That was the last time she was seen alive. Her body was found 2 weeks later, dumped inside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. She had been strangled like the others, her purse still intact, her phone still in her pocket. But something was missing, her hospital ID badge. A chilling trophy taken by the man who had stolen her life. The police were beginning to see the pattern, but they had no leads. No DNA. No witnesses. Just a series of women disappearing into the night, only to be found days or weeks later, lifeless and silent. And Paul Parker kept smiling. Kept driving. Kept killing. Victim number 4. Danielle Brooks, November 3, 2000. Danielle Brooks was 26 years old, a photographer known for her adventurous spirit. That night, she had spent hours at a friend's art gallery, helping set up an exhibit, chatting about the future, about her next big project. But when the night wound down and exhaustion set in, she decided to head home. She called a cab. It arrived within minutes. A yellow one. By morning, Danielle was missing. Her friends knew something was wrong immediately. She was responsible, punctual, never the type to disappear without warning. They searched, they called, they waited. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. Her body wasn't found until April of the following year, buried in a shallow grave deep in the Everglades. The decomposition was severe, making it impossible to determine exactly when she had been killed, but the bruising on her neck told the same story. No weapon. No gun. No knife. Just hands. How many more women had stepped into Paul Parker's cab, never knowing they had just sealed their fate? Victim number 5, Olivia Carter, August 17, 2002. By 2002, Parker had perfected his method. He didn't make mistakes. He knew where security cameras were placed. He knew which roads had the least traffic. He knew how to cover his tracks. Olivia Carter was 19, a college freshman barely 2 weeks into her first semester. She had spent the evening studying at the library, lost in her books, losing track of time. When she finally packed up, the buses had stopped running. She didn't want to call her parents, determined to prove she could handle things on her own. So she did what so many others had done. She got into a cab. Her roommate reported her missing the next morning. Her body was found 4 days later, wrapped in a tarp behind an abandoned gas station. Strangled. No signs of a struggle. No screams. No sound. Just another name on a growing list. At what point should the police have realized they had a serial killer on their hands? How many bodies had to pile up before they saw the truth? Victim number 6, Sarah Mitchell, March 21, 2003. Sarah Mitchell was 32, a schoolteacher beloved by her students, respected by her colleagues. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. But none of that mattered. She had spent the evening grading papers at a coffee shop, lost in her work, unaware of how late it had gotten. By the time she checked the clock, it was 1 a.m. Too late to walk home alone. She called a cab. It pulled up minutes later. She climbed in. That was it. Sarah was never seen alive again. Her body was found within 48 hours. A rarity. Dumped in a drainage ditch just off the highway. But this time Parker made a mistake. Tire tracks. Fresh, distinct, and traced back to a specific make and model of cab. A model registered to only a handful of drivers in the city. One of them was Paul Parker. For 6 years he had strangled his victims with terrifying ease. He had driven through the streets unnoticed, his hands responsible for taking at least 6 lives, perhaps more. And yet, no one had suspected him. Until now. How did a friendly, well-liked cab driver manage to evade capture for so long? And what finally led to his downfall? The city had been his hunting ground for years. But now the walls were closing in. 4 years, the investigation into the murders that plagued the streets of Florida had led nowhere, leaving detectives grasping at fragments of evidence that never quite fit together. Every crime scene was a dead end. No fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA, nothing that could point to a suspect. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving only the lifeless bodies of his victims behind. The pattern was clear, the method disturbingly consistent, but with no solid leads, the case remained unsolved. The police knew one thing for certain. Women were disappearing after getting into a taxi, and those who vanished were always found the same way, strangled, discarded, their voices forever silenced. The city was drowning in fear, and with every new body discovered, that fear only grew. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together every available clue, tracing the last known steps of each victim, and scouring surveillance footage in the hopes of catching even the slightest glimpse of the man responsible. They interviewed taxi companies, questioned cab drivers, and spoke with the friends and families of the victims, trying to establish connections. Yet every lead seemed to slip through their fingers like sand. The killer was careful, too careful. He left no witnesses, no traces, nothing to suggest who he was or why he was doing it. The lack of evidence only fueled public frustration. How could a predator be operating so openly and still remain invisible? Women were warned to be cautious, to avoid taking taxis alone at night, but warnings weren't enough. The killings didn't stop. The murderer was still out there, still hunting, still striking under the cover of darkness. Then, in the summer of 2003, everything changed. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. It wasn't a witness coming forward. It wasn't even a mistake made by the killer himself. It was something small, something almost too insignificant to notice. A single surveillance camera. A blurry, grainy piece of footage captured by a gas station security system. It wasn't positioned well and the lighting was terrible, but it showed just enough to shift the investigation in an entirely new direction. In the footage, a young woman could be seen stepping into a taxi at the edge of the parking lot. She appeared tired, unaware of the danger she was about to face. A cab ride, something millions of people took every day, should have been uneventful, just a quick trip home. But when detectives fast-forwarded the footage, they noticed something chilling. Minutes later, the same taxi returned. This time the passenger seat was empty. That was the moment law enforcement realized they had finally caught a glimpse of the man they had been hunting for years. It wasn't enough to identify him outright, but it was something more than they had ever had before. They could see the make and model of the taxi, a Ford Crown Victoria, a common vehicle used by cab drivers at the time. And most importantly, they had a partial view of the license plate. It wasn't complete, but it was a start. Detectives immediately went to work, cross-referencing taxi service records, narrowing down their list of possible suspects, and trying to determine who had been working that night. But Paul Parker was no amateur. He had spent years perfecting his methods, years avoiding mistakes, years blending in so seamlessly that no one had ever thought to suspect him. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no reports of suspicious behavior from passengers. He was polite, friendly, and well-liked among his colleagues. If anything, he was the kind of driver people requested, trustworthy, reliable, and safe. And yet, behind that carefully crafted image was something far more horrifying. The press conference that followed the discovery of the surveillance footage was tense, filled with frustration from both the police and the public. Reporters demanded to know why it had taken so long to find a lead, why a serial killer had been allowed to operate for years without capture, why women had to live in fear every time they hailed a cab. The city was restless. Women were terrified to go out at night. Taxi drivers, even those completely innocent, found themselves under intense scrutiny. Ridership plummeted. But even as the net began to tighten, Paul Parker continued his routine. He kept driving. He kept smiling. And he kept killing. The question now wasn't if the police were close. It was whether they would catch him before another woman stepped into his cab and never made it home. At this point in the investigation, what do you think should have been done differently? If you were leading the case, how would you have stopped him before he claimed another victim? Let me know in the comments. Paul Parker had spent years slipping through the cracks, moving like a phantom through the streets of Florida, hunting under the cover of darkness, selecting his victims with precision, and executing his crimes with a level of cold-blooded calculation that had left detectives grasping at shadows. He had created an illusion of normalcy, of trustworthiness, of being just another hard-working cab driver trying to make a living in the bustling city streets. With each passenger who climbed into his taxi, he remained calm, composed, and friendly, even luring them into a false sense of security before delivering the ultimate betrayal. For nearly 6 years, his method had been flawless, his actions seamless, his ability to vanish into the night unmatched. But in the end, it wasn't forensic evidence, it wasn't a sharp-eyed detective, it wasn't even the weight of suspicion finally closing in around him that led to his downfall. It was something far simpler, far more unexpected. It was a mistake. One night, like so many before, Parker was out prowling the streets, searching for his next victim. He knew exactly where to look: outside late-night diners, near dimly lit bus stops, along empty sidewalks where women walked alone, unaware that danger lurked just feet away. That night, his eyes landed on 26-year-old Amanda Collins, a young woman who had been out with friends and was now just trying to make it home safely. She stood on the curb, scrolling through her phone, distracted, vulnerable, the perfect target in Parker's mind. He pulled up beside her, rolled down the window, and offered that same warm, reassuring smile he had used so many times before. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. Parker followed his routine to the letter. He struck up a casual conversation, asking where she was headed, commenting on the weather, making sure she felt comfortable, all while steering the cab toward a secluded area he knew well. But this time something was different. This time, when he reached over the seat and wrapped his hands around his victim's throat, expecting the usual struggle followed by submission, he was met with something else entirely: resistance. Amanda wasn't like the others. The moment Parker's fingers tightened around her neck, she fought with every ounce of strength she had. She kicked, thrashed, and dug her nails into his arms, clawing at his skin so violently that blood began to drip down his wrists. He was strong, far stronger than she had expected, but she refused to go down without a fight. Desperation fueled her actions, adrenaline surging through her veins as she managed to twist just enough to drive her elbow into his face. The sudden impact sent a shock of pain through Parker's skull, momentarily disorienting him, and in that fleeting second of hesitation, Amanda reached for the door handle, flung it open, and threw herself from the slow-moving vehicle. She hit the pavement hard, her body rolling across the asphalt, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She scrambled to her feet, her vision swimming, her breath ragged, and ran, her voice hoarse as she screamed for help. Parker's cab screeched to a halt just yards away, but he didn't get out. He knew it was over. He had lost control of the situation, and worse, there was now a survivor. Amanda stumbled into the nearest gas station, gasping for air, her hands shaking as she grabbed onto the counter, begging the stunned clerk to call 911. When police arrived, they found a woman covered in bruises, scratches still fresh on her neck, terror evident in her wide, frantic eyes. But unlike the others, she had lived. And even more crucially, she remembered everything. For the first time, law enforcement had a witness. Someone who could describe their suspect in detail, someone who had seen the killer up close, someone who had literally scratched his skin, leaving behind the very DNA evidence that would finally crack the case wide open. Amanda recounted every chilling moment, the sound of his voice, the smell of his cologne, the way his demeanor had shifted from friendly to monstrous in an instant. And the most critical detail of all? She had seen his face. The man who had terrorized Florida for 6 years was no longer an enigma, no longer just a shadow slipping away into the night. He had a name, a cab number, a face. Within hours, detectives cross-referenced Amanda's description with a partial license plate from previous surveillance footage. They pulled records from cab companies, tracking down every driver who matched the vehicle make and model seen in the footage of missing women. And then, at last, the name surfaced: Paul Parker. A man with no prior criminal record. A man who had fooled them all. The arrest happened swiftly. Just past midnight, police surrounded Parker's home, their weapons drawn, voices sharp as they ordered him to step outside. The neighborhood was silent, the tension thick in the air. When Parker finally emerged, he didn't run. He didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. He simply stood in the doorway, his expression eerily calm, as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time. As officers moved in and clamped the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists, he remained silent, his eyes devoid of emotion, his mouth set in a straight, unwavering line. But his reign of terror was over. In the courtroom, Amanda Collins faced him once more. Though fear still lingered in her heart, she refused to let it silence her. Her voice was steady, unwavering, as she pointed at the man who had tried to kill her, the man responsible for so many lives lost. The evidence was overwhelming. Her testimony, the DNA beneath her fingernails, the scratches on Parker's arms that he had no explanation for, the surveillance footage, the endless trail of victims that all led back to him. The jury deliberated for only a short time before reaching their verdict. Paul Parker, the smiling cab driver who had spent years hunting in the dark, was found guilty on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. But the damage he had inflicted? That could never be undone. The streets of Florida had finally rid themselves of the monster that had stalked them for years, but for the families who had lost daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends to his hands, there was no true closure. The scars he had left behind, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. And as Parker sat in his prison cell, staring at the cold, gray walls that would be his home for the rest of his days, one question remained: did he feel remorse? Did he regret the lives he had taken? Or was he still, even now, replaying the thrill of the hunt, trapped in the memories of the crimes that had once given him so much power? What do you think? Was life in prison enough for Paul Parker, or did he deserve something worse? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. But here's the real question that lingers, the one that sends an unsettling chill down the spine of even the most hardened investigators. Was Paul Parker truly acting alone? Was he the only predator hiding behind the guise of a friendly, unassuming cab driver? Or was he merely one piece of a much larger, far more sinister puzzle? As detectives combed through the mountain of evidence left in Parker's wake, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that stretched far beyond the borders of Florida. Maps were spread across desks, pins marking locations where eerily similar crimes had taken place, spanning multiple states and dating back even further than Parker's first confirmed kill in 1997. Women, alone, vulnerable, vanishing without a trace after getting into a cab. Some were later found, strangled, discarded, forgotten. Others were never found at all. The more investigators looked, the more they began to wonder, had Parker killed more than they had accounted for? Had he traveled, picking up victims in other cities, disposing of their bodies in places no one had yet thought to search? Or, even more chilling, had he learned from someone else? Had he been part of a network of killers, each operating in the shadows, each using the same method, each evading capture for years? The thought was terrifying. Because if Parker wasn't the only one, that meant the nightmare wasn't over. Survivors of other attacks came forward, their stories hauntingly similar to Amanda Collins. A late-night cab ride gone wrong, a driver whose demeanor shifted from friendly to menacing in an instant, hands closing around their throats, only for them to miraculously escape. But these survivors described different men, different vehicles, and different states. Could it be coincidence? Or was something far darker at play? Even in prison, Parker refused to answer those questions. He offered no confessions, no explanations, and no remorse. He sat in his cell, cold and expressionless, refusing to acknowledge the possibility that there were more victims, more bodies buried in places the police had yet to uncover. And perhaps, that was the most terrifying thought of all, because if Parker wasn't talking, if there were more like him still out there, how many more lives were in danger? So the next time you call for a ride, when a car pulls up and a stranger behind the wheel offers you a polite smile, take a moment to ask yourself, who is really driving? Are they just another ordinary cab driver, another rideshare worker trying to make a living? Or are they something else entirely? Because as Paul Parker proved, monsters don't hide in the dark anymore. They drive among us, their hands on the wheel, their eyes in the rearview mirror, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What do you think? Could Parker have had an accomplice? Could more killers be lurking as cab drivers? Drop your theories in the comments. If you found this story chilling, hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying true crime stories.